All right, I do encourage everyone to turn on your cameras if you're able. You don't have to, but the idea behind this really is to study together. You know, I'm not so interested in giving a lecture, although I'm sure I'll talk a fair amount, but it's nice for us to feel like we're in the classroom together. So if you're able, please turn on your camera. If you're not, that's totally fine too. I'm going to share my screen here, and away we go. Is everybody able to see my screen there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's start off by saying the blessing for study, which is right here in front of us. Although before I do that, I just want to say thank you to the members of the Adult Education Committee for all their hard work over the course of the year, under the leadership of Karen Pakin, who, as we said, couldn't be here this evening for family reasons, but I want to thank her, and I want to thank all the members of the Adult Education Committee who have worked hard and put together some interesting programming for this year. So if you'd like, you can join me in the blessing for study. You can even turn on your camera, turn on your microphone, unmute yourself, and just step away a little bit from your microphone so that we can say the blessing together, and that way we can hear one another bless. Baruch atah Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal one, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves, to la'asok, to soak ourselves in words of Torah. So, you know, we say that blessing. We're not going to read a single word from the Torah tonight. And yet, when we talk about Torah, of course, we're talking about a broader thing than just the Torah. And the majority of what we'll be reading tonight, you'll see, will be Heschel and his own writings, but also then a fair amount from the prophets. Heschel's focus was often on the prophets and prophecy, and that's going to be the focus of our 3 sessions together. So I'm going to teach tonight and next week at the same time, and then our third week, 2 weeks from now, we're really honored to have Rabbi Shai Held, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of the Hadar Institute, to join us to talk about Heschel, and especially the connection between Heschel's ideas of radical amazement and ethics. And we'll see that will sort of dovetail with some of what we'll talk about here. So I'll just put this up a little bit so you can see Heschel rather than our shul logo. When you, and I don't know what everybody's level of familiarity with him and his philosophy, and at least even his name is, but when you hear the name Abraham Joshua Heschel, I wonder what words or what ideas or what thoughts come to mind. And you can throw them into the chat if you'd like, or if you want to unmute and tell us sort of doing a word association, what do you associate Abraham Joshua Heschel with? Let's see what we got in the chat. Civil rights, great. Hand in hand with overcoming unjust laws. And by the end of our first 2 sessions together, we'll be reading what Heschel has to say specifically about civil rights, and we'll be watching him march with Martin Luther King Jr. Any other ideas that come to mind, notions that come to mind? Heschel is one of the most important, Phil, I see intellectual, great. It's interesting, intellectual. His intellectualism is actually an intellectualism that will lead very much to action. He is one of the most important and one of the most unique, and actually one of the hardest to categorize thinkers of modern Judaism. With a lot of rabbis, we can look at them and we can say, oh, they fit there. Isaac Mayer Wise, Reform Judaism. Joseph Soloveitchik, Orthodoxy. Samson Raphael Hirsch, Modern Orthodoxy. Heschel is much harder to categorize. I like to say he's one of the few Jews who has the distinction of being Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox all at the same time. And we'll see exactly what that means. He is someone who will begin his life in an Orthodox setting, and he will end his life, not exactly having left orthodoxy, but at the same time having rejected and left behind a lot about the way that he grew up. So I want to spend the first few minutes running through the bio. Sai, you said a few minutes ago, this man's bio is amazing. It's unbelievable what he did. And that's why I want to spend a little time on his bio to give us a sense of the trajectory of the thinker that we're talking about here. Now, over the course of these 3 weeks, we're not just here to talk about Heschel. We're here to talk about the ideas that Heschel presents to us and what they have to do with our lives. And what we're going to see is that he has a unique view of what prophecy is, of the way that God talks to people, and that his unique view of the way God talks to people will lead him, and he hopes lead us, to a greater commitment to activism, a greater commitment to changing society, and to making society different than it was. So Abraham Joshua Heschel was born in 1907 in Warsaw, Poland. This is not a typo right here, where it says Abraham Joshua Heschel. That is his name. His name was Abraham Joshua Heschel. The reason for that is he was named after his great-grandfather, Rabbi Avraham Yehoshua Heschel, who was known as the Apter Rebbe. He was the Rebbe of the city of Apt, which leads me to believe, although I have no proof of this, that Heschel and I are distant cousins, because Apt, A-P-T, is also known as Apatow, and my grandmother's name was Apatowski. So I believe that at some point we were from Apatow, and maybe Heschel and I are cousins. At any rate, Abraham Joshua Heschel is named for his great-great-grandfather, I don't know how many greats, grandfather, Rabbi Avraham Yehoshua Heschel. And because of that, he was named Avraham Yehoshua Heschel. Later in his life, his wife Sylvia would call him Heschel. Apparently nobody called him Abraham. At least nobody Jewish ever called him Abraham. Non-Jewish clergy that he knew sometimes called him Abraham, but as a kid, he was called Avramel, and his wife called him Heschel, which I find hilarious. But apparently the Heschel that she called him was this first Heschel, not the second Heschel. So she called him after his middle name, Heschel, even though that was also his last name. He was the youngest of 6 children. I'm not going to read all this, but what's important here is that he was the scion, or the inheritor, the heir to a number of Hasidic dynasties. He was the descendant of, as I said, the Apter Rebbe, also known as the Ohav Yisrael. He was the descendant of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, the famous and well-known disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, second generation of Hasidic masters. Heschel was expected to become the next in line of one of these Hasidic dynasties that he was the descendant of. He had other ideas. As a child, he received a traditional Jewish upbringing, Hasidic upbringing. He became bar mitzvah at 13, and, like all the kids was then ordained a rabbi 3 years later at the age of 16. He was a genius. He was known from an early age to be able to have an incredible facility with Jewish text, with halakha, with Talmud, and in general with Jewish texts. But Heschel again had other ideas. Early on in his life, he came into contact with people who would open him up to other ways of thinking about Jewish texts. And he wanted to go to university. And so he, of his own volition, went off to Vilna. Vilna, for those of us who were there over the weekend to hear Dr. Kalman Weiser speak, we learned that Vilna was the center of scholarship, of Yiddish-speaking scholarship in those days. And Yiddish-speaking doesn't necessarily mean religious, but it is Jewish, of course. So Heschel goes off to Vilna to study in a gymnasium, a Jewish but not religious high school, and so that he could matriculate into university, because as a young chassid, he did not have the secular education that he needed to be able to go to university. He ultimately finds himself in Berlin at the University of Berlin, where he studies for a PhD in philosophy. And as it says here, among his classmates are Joseph Soloveitchik, the great Orthodox posek, known as, one of the greatest Orthodox thinkers of all time, and Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the future Rebbe of Lubavitch. So it's quite a power crew in Berlin in the 20s and 30s studying together. Heschel studied in two places at the same time. He studied at the University of Berlin, and he also studied at what's called the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, which in German means the Higher Institute for the Scientific Study of Judaism, which is a very dry name for the liberal seminary, the Reform seminary of in Europe that existed in Europe before the war. It was closed down, unfortunately, not surprisingly, when the Nazis took over. Something around 1940, I think it was closed down. But so Heschel then comes to study with the likes of Hermann Cohen, Martin Buber, probably Regina Jonas. She would have been there at the same time. Why do you suppose that a chassid, well, I'm not even going to say ex, because he's not exactly an ex-chassid. Why would a chassid want to study at a liberal yeshiva, at a reform seminary? What do you suppose was his goal there?
He wants to widen his knowledge.
That's exactly right, Denise. He wants to widen his knowledge. He was already a rabbi, right? So he didn't need the ordination per se, although he did attain ordination, because ordination in Reform Judaism, in liberal Judaism, means something different. But what he was really looking for, and the reason he went to study at the Hochschule, was because he was looking to be able to study Jewish texts through a critical lens. That is to say, who wrote the Torah as far as the Hasidic world is concerned? God, right? Via Moses. But in the liberal Jewish world at this time, just like today, they're already talking about who wrote the Torah in very different terms. Heschel wanted to be able to study texts philologically. He wanted to be able to study texts through that critical lens. He wasn't necessarily committed to liberal Judaism, Reform Judaism. In fact, he was quite out of place at this seminary, although, as we'll see, he'll be even more out of place once he gets to Cincinnati. So Heschel is ordained a rabbi twice, first in his Hasidic world, and again later as a Reform rabbi, once he studied at the Hochschule for a number of years. He also became a PhD in philosophy at around the same time. His dissertation was about the prophets. In fact, his dissertation was the German version of his great work, The Prophets. He reworked it later in the 60s to publish it in English. And we'll see how important the prophets are for Heschel throughout his thinking and his writing. By the way, a fun fact, Heschel had a hard time publishing his dissertation because another great thinker, Martin Buber, read it and didn't like it. So Buber convinced the dissertation committee not to publish Heschel's dissertation, at least at first. The rules were funny. You had to get a publishing house to publish your dissertation in order to get your PhD. And Buber actually made it very difficult for Heschel to publish his dissertation. They then later went on to become friends and to have a correspondence throughout their adult life. But the first thing that happened between Buber and Heschel was not the nicest. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but if you can just elaborate, you mentioned that ordination as a rabbi means something different in Reform Judaism. Can you elaborate what you mean by that?
Yeah, so in Orthodoxy, and especially in Chas, and I'm talking less Yeshiva University today, but thinking about Chassidut, about Haredi Judaism, to be a rabbi is to be a posek meaning someone who makes Jewish legal decisions. So you have to know lots of Talmud, you have to be relied upon to be able to make halakhic decisions. To be a rabbi in liberal Judaism, there's a pastoral element, and it also means studying Jewish texts through a historical and critical lens. So Heschel, even though he was a rabbi, probably couldn't walk into a Reform congregation and function as a rabbi there, right? I have a very different training than someone who comes out of the Haredi world. And so what Heschel was really looking for, that critical, but still committed to Jewish religious life kind of view, which is the difference again between studying at the Reformed seminary and studying at the university. The university, you're studying things through a critical and detached lens. As a Reformed rabbi, you're studying things because you care about Jewish life, but you're studying them through that critical lens. That kind of makes sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I want to just jump through a few things here. Heschel, after he publishes his dissertation, he was appointed by Martin Buber to head up what was called the Lehrhaus, which was created by Franz Rosenzweig. It was an adult education institute that was created in Frankfurt, and that functioned pretty much until it was shut down in the war. Heschel did that for about a year before he was arrested by the Nazis and deported because he was a Polish Jew, right? So at that time, ironically, a lot of people believed that the best thing you could do as a Jew was go back to Poland because the Nazis had come to power in Germany. And so, lots of Jews were fleeing Germany to go back to Poland. We all know that didn't end up very well. But Heschel believed at the time that his life was probably saved. And in fact, it probably was, because since he was in Poland, since he was able to go back to Poland, he was there for a little while, and he started a correspondence with the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Now, the Hebrew Union College, Julius Morgenstern, who was the president of the college back in the 30s and 40s, saw the writing on the wall in Europe, and he wanted to save as many scholars as he could. So they raised a lot of money, and they petitioned the US government to get as many visas as they could to save scholars, to bring scholars over to the United States. They were able to get 8 visas, and Heschel was one of the 8. So 6 months before the Germans invaded Poland, Heschel made his way to England to make it easier so that he could eventually get to the United States. While he was in England for 6 months, he started a whole new adult education center and ran it in London for 6 months. He left his mother and his sister behind in Warsaw. And again, 6 months before the war began, he was plucked from Europe, brought over to the United States to land in Cincinnati, leaving behind his home and everything that he had known to start a whole new life in America. Heschel's sister Esther, you'll see here, was killed in the bombing of Warsaw. His mother died at Treblinka. His other 2 sisters died during the war. They were a big family. I think one brother survived, something like that. Heschel was truly a survivor of the Shoah, even though he wasn't actually in Europe during the Shoah. He made his way to Cincinnati and spent 5 years at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Here's a picture of Heschel sitting. I know exactly where this spot is. I actually once took a picture to recreate this photo of Heschel, of myself sitting in that same spot. That's a young Heschel in Cincinnati at Hebrew Union College. He never fit in there. Reform in America was even more liberal than reform in Europe. He didn't understand the lack of ritual. He wore a kippah. He put on tefillin. He was a fairly observant Jew. And Hebrew Union College was never the place for him, but he was grateful to HUC for having saved his life, along with 7 other scholars in 1939. So after 5 years, he made his way to New York, found his way to the conservative movement, became a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which was a better place for him. Heschel occupied, you might say, kind of the right side of conservative Judaism in those days. The left side was occupied by Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, who, as we'll see, had a very non-traditional view of God. And Heschel spends a lot of his time arguing against Kaplan. He never says Kaplan exactly, but you can tell who he's arguing against in a lot of his writings. The rest of Heschel's career he spent at JTS as a professor at JTS. And then you can see in the 50s, he just starts publishing book after book after book. Man is Not Alone, The Sabbath, God in Search of Man, The Prophets, Torah Mina Shamayim, and in the middle, probably his greatest accomplishment, his daughter, Dr. Susanna Heschel, who is a professor of Jewish studies, I think at Dartmouth, maybe retired a couple of years ago. Heschel also served as an advisor for the Second Vatican Council. And as the 60s rolled on, he got more and more involved in civil rights issues and what we might call political and social justice issues. So he was an advisor to the Second Vatican Council. He marched in the civil rights movement, and we'll see him marching with King by the end of next week's session. He founded an organization called Clergy and Laity Concerned About the Vietnam War. The last 10 years of his life, it's not that he wasn't writing, he was writing plenty, but he was more focused on social justice issues than probably on writing per se. Heschel died in his sleep, I think, of a heart attack in late 1972. He was not quite 66, so he was very young. He managed to accomplish a lot, to do a lot in his 66 years. And you can see why I say that he's one of the few that was Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox all at the same time. Heschel never exactly left behind his Orthodox roots, his Hasidic roots. He always remained an observant Jew. He kept Shabbat, he kept kosher. One of the reasons he didn't fit in Cincinnati, there are pictures of, or there are reports of Heschel eating, the only one eating kosher food in a room full of rabbinical students and professors in Cincinnati. And so he never really left behind his self-understanding as an Orthodox Jew. And yet he was highly critical of the kind of orthodoxy that was not socially aware in the ways that he was. So he combines the social awareness of liberal Judaism with the observance of Orthodox Judaism. And as we'll see in a little while, also with the critical view of text and of Torah of Reform Judaism. So as I said, Heschel is Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox all at the same time. Everybody wants to claim him, and rightfully so. So before I go on, any questions or comments or thoughts about any of that? All right, I want to read you a couple of stories from his biographers. This is from a two-part biography by Edward Kaplan and Samuel Dresner. It looks like this. You can see all my notes there. And I think this gives us a sense really of the kind of person this is. And then we're going to jump right into reading about prophecy, and you'll see why prophecy is so important. So this is about Heschel in the late 20s and early 30s. You can see the young Heschel here. Heschel answered these crises, and the crises we're talking here are intellectual crises of where is Judaism going in the early 20th century. Heschel answered these crises as a modern thinker, adapting academic disciplines to his Hasidic spirit. The various languages he had mastered mediated disparate worlds. He used German to harvest the university curriculum and Wissenschaft des Judentums, which means scientific study of Judaism. Spiritual foundations were provided by texts in ancient and rabbinic Hebrew and Aramaic, Bible, Talmud, Zohar, and other Hasidic sources. Heschel knew modern Hebrew as well, the idiom of secular and religious Zionism and university-based scholarship. Yiddish, however, remained the instrument of his soul. And I forgot to mention that in addition to all the other things he did, he also published Yiddish poetry. And so Heschel was working in all these languages, and in each language, he's doing something different, right? So he's writing Yiddish poetry to express his soul while he's studying Wissenschaft, studying critical scientific study of Judaism in German, while writing in English, while speaking modern Hebrew because he cared about Israel and he was a Zionist, while reading ancient texts in Aramaic and Hebrew. And so maybe that's just how Jewish life works, but Heschel, unlike a lot of people, was able to function in all of those worlds. These stories actually tell more about what he was like in the classroom. Apparently, he was not the greatest teacher. He was like kind of absent-minded, didn't always prepare very well, sometimes kind of grumpy and condescending in the classroom. His focus was not really, he didn't always enjoy teaching rabbinical students because for the same reason that professors these days don't always enjoy teaching undergrads. He didn't think they cared enough. He didn't think they were as engaged in things as he thought they should be. He'd rather be writing or marching or something else. So we get some interesting stories here. This is from Rabbi Albert Plotkin, who incidentally was Shoshi, my ex-wife's childhood rabbi. So he studied with Heschel back in the 30s in Cincinnati. Heschel could lead receptive students to religious insights. One day he walked into class and said, Something very great happened today. What? Asked future Rabbi Albert Plotkin. Heschel responded, the sun rose. So what? Asked Plotkin. Heschel said, did you ever see the sunrise? No, Plotkin replied. Heschel suggested that the next morning they take a walk. He was demonstrating to the future rabbi how the most mundane event could evoke awe and radical amazement, the fountain of sacred sensitivity. The idea of radical amazement is central to Hasidic thought, and Heschel would bring it into liberal Judaism. One of his criticisms of Reform Judaism was that there wasn't enough awe in Reform Judaism. It was too dry, not enough ritual, not enough radical amazement at the world. Two more stories. These are from his time at the Conservative Seminary, JTS. There were also illuminating classroom moments. The law committee of the conservative movement had recently debated whether gelatin was kosher. Heschel came into class and asked, gentlemen, what is your opinion? Is gelatin kosher or not? The rabbinical students became engrossed in discussion for several minutes. Heschel interrupted, gentlemen, can you tell me if the atomic bomb is kosher? So what's the point he's making here in this story? What is the message of the interruption of this gelatin conversation with the atomic bomb question? Anybody want to translate that for us? Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Well, I think what he's saying is that it's not really important that whether or not gelatin is kosher or not, because to be honest, I mean, the atomic bomb is kosher is irrelevant to the atomic bomb, and the implication that I drew was that kosher is irrelevant to gelatin.
Interesting. Okay, thank you, Peter.
A step further, kosher is irrelevant.
All right, the spoken like a good Reformed Jew there, right? And so, Wayne, go ahead. Let's add to that. Wayne, you're muted right now.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I was I'm not similar to Peter, but different in that it's not that it's not relevant or important, but the kosher, it shows that the kosher laws are so intricate. It takes a lot of discussion as to, well, what exactly is kosher? What exactly isn't? And then he says, well, he compares it to, and he's saying that kosher isn't immediately obvious, but then he throws in, what about the atomic bomb? Well, that's slightly more obvious. And he was making an exaggeration.
Great. Yeah, I mean, so two important points about this. Number one, Heschel kept kosher. His whole life, he always kept kosher. So he's not saying kosher is not relevant. Although, Peter, I think your point is still there because, so that's point number one. He kept kosher his whole life. Point number two, there is no such thing as kashrut regarding an atomic bomb, right? An atomic bomb can't be kosher or not, halakhically speaking. But can a device really be kosher? Can it really be Jewishly acceptable if it's able to kill, right? So I think the point that Heschel is making here is something like, why are we debating minutia when there are big, important ethical things going on in the world? So he never stops keeping kosher. He won't go as far as to say kosher doesn't matter. Kosher is not important because the atomic bomb is what matters. So there are Reform rabbis who would go that far, right? But Heschel won't go as far as to say kosher doesn't matter. But what he will say is, why are we spending time on this, if you'll pardon my French, on this bullshit minutia, when there's an atomic bomb out there that's what we should really be talking about from a Jewish perspective. Let's talk about what Judaism has to say about the ethical issues of the atomic bomb. Okay, so that's story number one. Story number two is a little bit similar. Heschel was often careless with his required classes, it says, but sometimes his neglect produced unexpected benefits. One day, he interrupted his lecture on Maimonides and left the room to fetch his morning mail. I can just picture his students as Heschel just walks out of the room during the middle of a lecture to get his to get his mail. When he returned, he read the class a letter he had received. A synagogue in an old Jewish area of the Bronx was about to be sold. There were two potential buyers, a Black Baptist church and a large bank. The synagogue board knew that according to tradition, a synagogue should not be converted into a church. Nevertheless, they asked Heschel for an opinion. So, gentlemen, you are soon to be rabbis. What is your psak? What's your decision? After several seconds of uncomfortable silence, a student approvingly quoted the traditional psak, never to a church. Heschel listened politely, then rose, stroked his beard, and spoke. May I insult you? If it is sold to a bank, it will become a temple of capitalism. If sold to a church, it will continue to be a temple of God. Should a rabbi endorse a shul being converted into a temple of capitalism? So I think this is a similar message to the last one, which is to say, halakha needs to be more than just the minutia, more than just what the tradition hands down. We need to consider the ethical implications in deciding halakhic things. This is actually deeply Hasidic, right? Hasidut is in many ways a rejection of the sort of pilpulistic back and forth arguing of halakha, because there are spiritual and ethical matters involved here. So Heschel brings I think the Hasidic spirituality to a liberal Jewish ethics in a world that also cares about halakha. And that's why I like these two stories. I think they so deeply express the complexity of who he is and what he cares about. Now we get to prophecy. So before we ask Heschel, let me ask you, what is a prophet and what does a prophet do? Somebody help us out here. What is a prophet and what does a prophet do?
To predict the future.
All right, predict the future. Wayne?
Yeah, I don't, yeah, that would be my first response, but I think in the past we found that prophets can only predict the future when we study them in history and we go back and say, oh yeah, they were right. But my take on it is that they try to open up the eyes of people, so who are to some heavy realities. There's smoke in the air today. There's a big problem here. We don't get smoke in Toronto. There's something going on here, and there's more than just a fire. And tries to bring the audience to something more serious.
Okay, great. So in our everyday parlance, we use the word prophet to mean someone who can predict the future. So I understand why that's the first place our minds go. In Judaism, a prophet isn't someone who predicts the future. In Judaism, in a sense, and this is me, not Heschel, but in Judaism, in a sense, the prophet is someone who can change the future or who calls on people to change the future. Think about Jonah. Jonah doesn't predict the future. In fact, Jonah is dead wrong about what he says is going to happen. He says Nineveh is going to be destroyed. But Jonah is wrong. Nineveh is not destroyed. Does that mean Jonah was a bad prophet, an unsuccessful prophet? No, in fact, Jonah was a successful prophet because he managed to ensure that Nineveh was not destroyed. So the prophet's role actually is to admonish the people and try to bring about a different outcome. In fact, prophets are often not even talking about the future at all. Prophets are often talking about God's expectations for the people. That's the kind of prophet that Heschel has in mind when he comes to talk about the prophet. So I want to read, this is a fairly long passage from the prophets, this book, The Prophets. But I want to read the whole thing because I think in many ways, Heschel's entire understanding of prophecy and social justice is encapsulated in this passage. And once we read this whole passage, we're going to sort of like jump into a few different areas and ideas and try to figure out how this leads from the one place to the other. So the first question we have to ask is, what does a prophet do? The second question we have to ask is, who is the prophet listening to? Who is the prophet hearing from? Is it possible I could get somebody to volunteer to read It's about a little over a page, starting here from the anger of the Lord. Anybody willing to do some reading for us?
I'll read, Rabbi.
That'd be great, Peter. Thank you.
The anger of the Lord was directed not only at the nations, but also at the people he had chosen. The people of Judah had rejected the Torah of the Lord, and had not kept his statutes, and the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, creditors, sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of shoes. They that trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, and turn aside the way of the afflicted. Man may remain callous, but God cannot keep silent. Terrible is his voice, because he has a heart. It was not only iniquity,
Not only iniquity.
didn't look right. It was not only iniquity that had aroused the anger of the Lord. It was also piety upon which his words fell like a thunderbolt. Sacrifice and ritual regarded as the way that leads to the Creator. The men and the institutions dedicated to sacrificial worship were powerful and revered. Came a, quote, dresser of sycamores from the wilderness of Judah and proclaimed the word of God.
All right, we'll stop there for a second. The dresser of sycamores here is the prophet Amos. So this is Heschel talking about the prophet Amos. So before we go on any further, what is he saying here? What is Heschel saying about prophets, or about the prophet Amos? And I know it's a little confusing. Or what is he saying about God by way of the prophet here?
But isn't he saying something similar to what we've been talking about in the story of Aaron's sons? You not only have to do it, you have to do it right, and you have to have the right frame of mind in doing it.
Okay, great. So the idea, and in fact, we'll see this down here a little bit, that and this is actually related or similar to the Haftarah for Yom Kippur afternoon. The whole, is this the fast I desire? How dare you fast and pray while you go defraud the poor, right? He says, the prophet says, I will not accept your burnt offerings and cereal offerings. Why won't God accept your burnt offerings and things? Because you're busy acting in unjust ways toward the poor, but rather let justice well up as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Okay, so that's the first thing, as Peter points out, that it doesn't just, it's not just about making sacrifices. It's also about the way you act, according to Heschel, according to the prophet. Something else, what do we learn about God from this sentence right here? What do we learn about Heschel's view of God? Yeah, Phil?
I think he's saying that God cares about what people do. God doesn't just sit back and watch.
Mm-hmm. God cares about what people do. And Angel just put into the chat, God has feelings. So what? I mean, maybe that's obvious. Who is Heschel arguing with here when he says this?
Well, I guess he's arguing with people who think that God only cares about how people, I don't know how to express it, that God only cares about how people literally keep the commandments and do the sacrifices, and that's it. And he's saying that's not it.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe he's arguing, first of all, with people who perform rituals but don't behave ethically, right? Who else? Peter, go ahead.
No, actually, it's Joy.
Oh,
You
Joy,
know,
go
I
ahead.
was thinking about a conversation we had in Torah study at one point, where, you know, people will be so observant and so attuned to keeping every commandment on Shabbat, and then they go to work on Monday, and they're mean and miserable and not ethical in what they do. You can't have it both ways. Either you are and you observe the mitzvot and you act in an ethical and moral manner, or you're not. But you can't be both things at the same time,
Why not, Joy? What's wrong with that?
because neither one is real. It's both fake.
So what's wrong with that? Why can't I be fake?
I want to be a Jew. I want to be a good Jew. I want to be a person who observes and understands and is kind to my fellow man, regardless of who that man is.
Okay, sure, but where does that rule come from that says I have to be kind to my fellow man? Where does that, who says, where does that come from?
Well, right on the Torah, it says, remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We have to be kind to those who are strangers. We have to be kind to the widow. We have to remember not to take everything out of the fields and leave it for the widow and the poor. I mean, we have obligations.
I'm going to push you one more time. Sorry, Joy. Tell me if I'm annoying you. But why? Where does that come? Yes, the Torah says that. That's right. But where does it come from? Who says that treating people, unkindly is bad? Who says that, defrauding a widow is bad? Where does it say that? Well, not where does it say that, but why? Where does that idea come from?
From God.
From God. And that's what Heschel is saying here. So that's the other person that Heschel is arguing with here. Heschel is arguing with the one who says God is a human idea. God is some ethical notion that we care about, a Platonic idea, something built into the fabric of the universe, but not somebody with passions and feelings. God has a heart. Angel, you put it into the chat. God has feelings. So, thank you, Joy. Sorry if I was aggravating there. So that is the key to what Heschel believes and to who Heschel is arguing with. Heschel is arguing with Plato. He's arguing with Aristotle, who says God is the unmoved mover. What does Aristotle's unmoved mover do? Contemplate itself, right? Does Aristotle's unmoved mover care about you? Does Aristotle's unmoved mover care about whether you defraud the poor and a widow? No. Yeah, those are, there's such a thing as ethics in Aristotle's philosophy, but not because God cares. Heschel's God cares. Heschel's God has a heart. So I want to jump forward a little bit and we'll explore this idea a little bit further. Who was reading? Peter, do you mind reading a little further, starting here from yet the nations were not?
Yet the nations were not, like Israel, condemned for internal transgressions, but for international crimes, although there was no law in existence governing international relations. Excuse me. Amos, however, presupposes the conception of a law which was not embodied in a contract, the conception of a right and wrong which precedes every contract, since all contracts derive their validity from it. Here a conception of law was expressed which was binding on for all men, though it was not formally proclaimed, and there was a lawgiver capable of enforcing it and coercing transgressors.
Okay, lawgiver here with a capital L, meaning we're talking about God here. So again, imagine the intellectual who makes the argument that sounds like, oh, good and bad is a human construct, or good and bad is a Platonic ideal. There is a notion of good that exists in the universe, and all people have access to it through their rational faculty. If we reason enough, if we think hard enough, we can come up with what's good and bad. Heschel, in response to that, says that's not where good and bad comes from. For Heschel, and remember, he's a traditionalist. This is his Hasidic background talking. For Heschel, good and bad doesn't come from human rational thought. Where does it come from? It comes from God. There is a living God, he says, who cares. I'll get to that in a second. Did Amos speak as a champion of ethics? Was it in the name of the moral law that the shepherd of Tekoa left his sheep to proclaim his message in Samaria? No, he says, it wasn't about ethics per se. It was, Amos insisted that it was God whose call he followed and whose living word he carried. There is a living God who cares. If we could sum up Heschel's thought in one sentence, it would be that sentence right there. There is a living God who cares. Justice is more than an idea or a norm. Justice is a divine concern. What obtains between God and his people is not only the covenant of mutual obligations, but also a relationship of mutual concern. The message of God is not an impersonal accusation, but the utterance of a redeemer who is pained by the misdeeds, the thanklessness of those whom he has redeemed. His words, meaning God's words, are plaintive and disconsolate. What has Heschel added here to the discourse of Judaism? Go ahead, Peter or Joy.
I'm sorry, Rob, I'm having a real hard time with this, because how can we say that okay, I believe we have a God that cares. On the other hand, why did it take him or take God 400 years to hear our cries in Egypt? And how many people have said, and where was God during what went on in the Second World War? Either God cares or God doesn't care, but you can't have it. There's got to be some connection to this, and I'm just not seeing a connection.
Yeah, okay. All right, that's a very fair question. If God cares so much about us, and Heschel believes that God does, yeah, he uses the word pathos, right? Pathos is this deep pathological caring for people, then why didn't God prevent the Holocaust? Why doesn't God make it so there's no suffering in the world? Anybody want to have an answer to that question? Peter or Joy?
Isn't that the Job question? Why do bad things happen to good people?
That is the Job question. Yeah. Yeah. Wayne, go ahead.
I thought it's because God cannot. We're not puppets. God cannot control the way one human being connect towards the other. Throughout history, there is good and evil, and in every single religion and culture, there's symbols of good and evil, and a struggle of one prevailing over the other. That's my understanding. Is it's not God's place to make us into puppets. He creates us to use our wisdom and not our and not our evil. But he can't control. God cannot control that. We are who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Wayne. Other thoughts to this question? Yeah, Rona.
Well, it's more or less what Wayne said, but it's the whole thing about free will. God gave us free will, and every war, every act of inhumanity is human made. It's us. So if we can't have it both ways, we can't have free will and then when we act freely, blame it on God.
Mm-hmm. Joy, are you satisfied with the answers you're getting here?
No, but I do understand the concept of free will, and I believe that certainly is true. It's just that, Heschel is saying that God cares, but yet we can, if he was alive, we could show him cases where it does not appear so.
Mm-hmm. Denise, go ahead.
If God made man in his own image, then it means that God and man are one. So if God is in the man and the men have all their faults and their difficulty in choosing good and bad, then God is not above man. And I don't think that God cares more about the chosen people than he cares about anybody else, because then he wouldn't have allowed what happened in the Second World War.
Mhm.
Even if men and women and humanity did many things wrong, like reject maybe the belief in God, I don't think that God would be mean enough to kill all the children.
Yeah. I think, if Heschel were here, I think he would say something similar to what some of you have said, which is to say we have free will. It's not God's job to make us behave well. God's job is to tell us how to behave. And we're going to see in a little while, we'll see how far we get today. We're going to see how Heschel believes God is calling to us. But I mean, let me ask it this way. And this is no reflection on my actual children, but if I care deeply about the rights of the poor, and my children who I have raised and I have taught and I've told them how I think it's right to behave, my children go off and steal a lot of things from a lot of poor people. Does that mean I don't care about the poor? Heschel, I think, would say no, that the people's actions, what goes on in the world, is a reflection of how people act, that God doesn't have the power to control how we act in the same way that I don't have the power to control how my children act or any of us do. God's role is to teach and to advise and to admonish via the prophet. Peter and Joy.
Just a quick question. Doesn't it all come back to the line from Amos, which says, but let justice well up like the waters and righteousness like a mighty stream? Isn't he saying, I don't know who, I mean, I think Amos is this is Amos speaking, and I'm not familiar enough with the book of Amos to argue that, but that statement says, it seems to me to say the same thing as the one that you had highlighted, which is God, the living God who cares.
Yeah. I mean, this is the prophet Amos speaking. Amos is really the original social justice warrior in a lot of ways. Amos is, I think it believes exactly that. Remember that when the prophet speaks for God. It's as if God is speaking the words. We'll see later what Heschel says about who the prophet is and why it matters, but it's as though God is speaking these words, it kind of through the prophet, but actually not exactly through the prophet. So what is God saying? God is saying, offer me all the fatted beasts you want. I don't care. I won't accept any of them. What I really care about is let justice well up as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. So in other words, when we ask where was God during the Holocaust, God was up there crying. That's where God was during the Holocaust, because God cares so much about God's children, and yet God is just watching us kill each other. That is the image that Heschel has created here of a God who cares about us and who is telling us over and over and over again how we're supposed to behave, and we are just not listening. And God is distraught. God is distraught. So again, let's step out of the theology for just a moment. Who is Heschel describing? I think he's talking about himself. Who's distraught about society? Heschel is distraught because all of us, we create God in our own image, right? And this is a man who lived through Nazi Germany, and then lived through the 60s, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War. Heschel is looking around at the world he's living in and saying, God is distraught with the world that we're living in. And he finds the words of the prophets to be the inspiration for the message he wants to deliver about just how broken the society around him is. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
So does that mean that I can make myself feel better by saying that God is up there crying, watching what a mess people are making of the world, and then gets to the point, as parents often do, when they say, I just cannot tolerate this any longer, I'm stepping in and I'm doing something about it?
Well, does God do that though? Like, have we ever seen God step in and do things about it?
Did he not come and get the Hebrew people out of
Egypt.
Egypt? I mean,
Well, in our
did he send the Allies during the Second World War? It's like the joke. God keeps sending the firemen and that, and the guy keeps saying, God will save me. Well, that's how God saves us.
right. So I think, I mean, the two examples you gave are very different examples, right? Because the first one is from our mythology. God comes and saves people in our mythology. But I think even Heschel would suggest that in the real world, there aren't miracles like that. What did Heschel say was a miracle before? That the sun rose, right? I don't think Heschel's looking for any Red Seas being parted. I think Heschel believes that God speaks by teaching us the right way, by teaching us how we're supposed to live. In fact, I think let's jump to that. Yeah, let's jump to that.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Comment on what you were saying about God cries. And if you take that and you said God cries because we weren't doing good, and I put that in quotes. Because, all right. But who wasn't doing good? It wasn't all of humanity. I'm talking about the Shoah. It wasn't all of humanity that wasn't doing good. It was the Germans, at least from our point of view. It was the Germans, all right? And it wasn't even the Germans, it was the Nazis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in that moment, right?
Is God crying about us? No, let me rephrase that. Is God crying about the Jews that were being discriminated against and put into the concentration camps and all that? Or is God crying about the Nazis?
That's a good question. I don't know. I wish Heschel was here to ask that question. Is God crying about the bad behavior or about the suffering? Well, actually, I think maybe we can jump to the next section and try to answer the question. I think God is crying about the suffering. I think God cares about the suffering of the people. I'll just point out one quick thing, because I'm a theology nerd, so I care about these kinds of things, that again, I want to point out the difference between a living God. One of the things I've learned in graduate school is to ask what's at stake. Whenever anybody writes anything, you ask what's at stake. Why did they say the thing that they said? So when Heschel writes, there is a living God, what's at stake for Heschel here? Who is he arguing against? He's arguing here really against the Mordechai Kaplans of the world, who would have argued that God is an idea. God is, for those of you who took our, who used to come to lunch and learn, we studied Kaplan. God is the powers in the universe that make for meaning. God is the fact that love is possible. God is the fact that, that people can create legacies and like we have the capacity to do great things in the world. God is the engine that drives the human search for meaning in the world. That's what Reconstructionism believes. It's probably what Mordechai Kaplan was arguing at the same time back in the 60s. Heschel said, no, God cares. God is God. There is a living God who cares about us. So I think that statement's really important because Heschel is arguing against somebody here. And the somebody that he's arguing against is the one who doesn't believe in a supernatural personal God who cares about people. So with that in mind, let's jump to the idea of pathos, that God cares. Okay, I'm going to read a bit here and then we'll talk about it just like we did before. So prophecy consists in the, is that what I want to read? Yeah, I want to jump to this. Yeah, I do want to read that. Okay. Prophecy consists in the inspired communication of divine attributes to the prophetic consciousness, which is to say the prophet somehow apprehends things about God, God's attributes, and conveys them to the world. That's what the prophet does. As we have seen, the divine pathos is the ground, I think this is supposed to be groundstone, is the groundstone of all these attitudes. A central category in the prophetic understanding for God. It is echoed in almost every prophetic statement. God's pathos, the fact that God cares, is the center of what the prophet has to say to us. To the prophet, we have noticed, God does not reveal himself in an abstract absoluteness, but in a personal and intimate relation to the world. He does not simply command and expect obedience. He is also moved and affected by what happens in the world and reacts accordingly. Let's take a look at that sentence for just a moment. What is Heschel saying here in this sentence? And what do you think about it? What is your reaction to this idea that God is moved and affected by what happens in the world? Any thoughts on that? Any reactions?
Well, in that sense, I'm sorry. In that sentence, what is strange is that he is also moved and affected by what happens in the world and reacts accordingly. What are the reactions of God?
So, yeah, yes, and somebody just asked the same thing in the chat. The reaction of God is, look, as follows: sorrow, pleasure, or wrath. The reaction is entirely emotional, right? So this is the answer to Joy's question. God does not have the power to do things to us, to change things to us. This is not the God of the Torah who can send a plague on you. This is a God whose reactions are emotional. God cares deeply. God is affected by things that go on in the world. This is classic Hasidic thought. This is one of those areas that's so interesting that Heschel brings his Hasidic background into his liberal Judaism, because one of the things that the Hasidim teach is that people have the power to affect God. Now, I'll give you an example. Why did Jews put on tefillin? Anybody? Why did Jews put on tefillin?
To keep the covenant.
Okay, to keep the covenant. Why else? Why? You know, what are some other reasons Jews put on tefillin? To remind you of something, right? You shall write them. Oh, Angel said to pray. You shall write them on the doorpost, on the, what is it? On your.
Rabbi, it's in the Shema.
Yeah, it's in the Shema, right? You should bind the words as a sign upon your hand and let them be a symbol between your eyes, right? So I put on tefillin to remind me of something. I put on tefillin to remind me of what God expects of me. According to Chabad, why do people put on tefillin? Why does Chabad stand outside No Frills and try to get every Jewish man who walks by to put on tefillin? Wayne, do you know the answer? Oh, Wayne, you're muted. Oh, there you are. Nope, you're muted.
Okay, touch screen. Anyways, the symbolic part of it, whereby you have the two little scrolls, one on your arm, or and it has to be on your muscle, so that stands for strength. And then the other one is in between your eyes, which is like third eye. In fact, I think in Hindu they even have the same idea. I forget what they call it. So the point being is that for using your equally, your mind, the strength comes from both your mind and physical strength. And it's and as Jews, we kind of like to use a lot of props, such as
Okay.
Passover. We have a lot of props, so that's
All right.
why.
So let me interrupt you there because I agree with everything you just said. That's really good rational Judaism, even rational Orthodox Judaism, right? I put that on my arm to remind me of something, to remind me how to act, to remind me how to think it. It strengthens me. It brings me goodness, etc. That's really good rational Judaism. But that's not why Chabad puts on tefillin. Why does Chabad stand outside no frills and try to get me to put on tefillin? Wayne, or not Phil, do you know?
I think that they believe that that'll bring the Mashiach.
Yes, because they believe that it has the power to affect God. When I put on tefillin, it affects God. And you know this story because it's also known as Tikkun Olam. Every time we do a mitzvah, it releases a spark back to God. And when all the sparks are collected, then what will happen? Then the Messiah will come, right? That's good Kabbalistic Hasidic thinking. People have the power to affect God. So what has Heschel done here? Heschel has made that ethical. He's said not that God is affected by whether I put on tefillin or not, but that God is affected by whether or not I treat other people with kindness and respect. That God is affected by whether or not humans listen to the ethical responsibility that God puts out into the world. So this is an amazing amalgam of Hasidic thought, of like mystical Kabbalistic thought that says people have the power to affect the Godhead, and of liberal Jewish ethical thought that says what God cares about is actually your ethics. Heschel was the first to do this. Heschel was the first to say that, to bring together the God of Chassidut and the ethical God of liberal Judaism, and to say you have the power to affect God because God cares so deeply about us. I wanted to jump down here. The God of the philosophers is like the Greek ananke, unknown and indifferent to man. This is your Aristotle's unmoved mover. He thinks but does not speak. He is conscious of himself but oblivious of the world. While the God of Israel is a God who loves, a God who is known to and concerned with man. And in fact, I want to jump down even further. I love this little paragraph. Zeus is passionately interested in pretty female deities and becomes inflamed with rage against those who incite his jealousy. The God of Israel is passionately interested in widows and orphans. Divine concern means his taking interest in the fate of man. It means that the moral and spiritual state of man engages his attention. It is true that his concern, God's concern, I know it's a lot of hims and he's, but that's how Heschel wrote back in the 50s. It is true that his concern is to most of us one of the most baffling mysteries, but it is just as true that to those whose life is open to God, his love and care are a constant experience. Let's talk about that last sentence, and I think with this we'll end. We're going to go about 5 more minutes, and then we'll end there. What does it mean that God's love and care, to those whose life is open to God, his care and love is a constant experience? Talk to me about what he means there. Who's he talking about, and what's he trying to teach us to do?
Right. I think that what it means that you have to believe in God to be open to God. You have to believe without any other reason. You have to open to God in order to experience his love and care.
And you have to be looking for it also, right? Looking for God. You know, Heschel's great-great-great-great-grandfather, I think it was Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, was the one who once said, "Where does God live? Wherever we let God in." So this, again, that Hasidic idea that God is sort of waiting, and that God's care, God's presence is always evident as long as you're looking for it. So I look out my window and I see a tree. I might say, oh, that's a tree. Or I might say, wow, that's a tree. Look how amazing that tree is. Look how intricate. Look how extraordinary. Look how beautiful. Okay, and then I'm seeing God. And the same thing with a person. I might say, oh, look, there's a homeless bum on the street. Or I might say, that's a child of God and an opportunity to make a life a little bit better. I'm seeing God now. I am, to those, as he says, to those whose life is open to God, God's care and love are a constant experience. If your eyes are open to it, you can experience God caring about the world in every moment of every day. But most of us aren't looking for it. And that's our spoiler alert for next week as to who the prophet is. Because for Heschel, the prophet is the one who actually hears the voice, the one who hears what the rest of us mostly ignore. So I saw a couple of hands, Peter, and then maybe Wayne, if he still wants to say something.
I think two comments. First of all, when you said you look out your window and you see this tree, I looked out my window and for the first time today, I saw blue sky. I found, juxtapose that with what we're talking about is very interesting. But the comment I wanted to make was, it seems to me that all of what we've said is about man inventing God in such a way that they can, that man, an individual man or woman, can accept the God that they've invented.
Is that a critique of Heschel? Are you saying that, that this is an invented God? This is your view, and that's why you can accept it? I'm not totally sure I understand where you're going with that.
No, I'm not. I go back to the comment, the sentence about God cares. Well, God can't care unless man cares. And therefore we invent a God that cares, and we bestow on that God various characteristics.
Yes, I see what you're saying. So I think, Peter, that what you're saying, you're actually in many ways quoting the Reconstructionist God, right? That's what Kaplan would say if he was here. We make God in our image. We know these forces, these powers in the universe exist. We have the capacity to make others' lives better and to love and to, have legacy and to do tikkun olam. And so we write stories about a God who cares about those things because we care about those things. That's good liberal Jewish Reconstructionism. And actually, mostly that's my theology. That's what I think too. Heschel says no. That's actually exactly what Heschel is arguing against. And we don't have to agree with Heschel. In fact, we may well not agree with Heschel. Heschel in many ways is not a liberal Jew in that sense, or at least he is a theist. He's a traditional theist because he believes that there is a living God who cares, not a figment of our imagination, not a God made in our image. It's the other way around. There is a God who cares. The reason that right and wrong is because God says so, not we write stories about God saying so because we, through our rational faculty, know what's right and wrong. And that ultimately is the argument that's happening here. Now, I think, and I don't know about everybody else's beliefs in theology here, I actually don't agree with Heschel on this point. I don't believe in Heschel's living God in the same way that he does, but he does. And I think that's what I want to drive home here, is that for Heschel, there is a living God, and the living God talks to people. And as we're going to see next week, here's your spoiler alert, God's voice is booming out across all creation all the time. And most of us aren't listening. Only a few people are listening, and those people are the prophets. So that's what he's trying to teach us here. And ultimately, you can see how this leads to social justice. You can see how this leads to marching with Martin Luther King, right? If you can be one of the few that can hear the voice, then you know that complacency is not okay. You know that you have a responsibility to make society better than it is. But for Heschel, that comes out of the notion, directly out of the notion, that there is a living God who cares about us. Wayne, you get the last word.
I think you said everything, so I'll make it quick. On that paragraph, what stands out to me is that comparison between Zeus and God, where Zeus is more, it's emotion, it has a drive of emotion, and also selflessness, like, and whereas God, it's when they mentioned widows, orphans, that's also like maybe a symbol for vulnerable people. So to experience God is in our point of view, in a Judaic point of view, is philanthropy and humility, and that's in sharp contrast with someone who's full of themselves and just looks and full of passion of beauty, of females and rage and so forth. So anyways, it's that contrast that I feel is important.
Yeah, I think that's a really neat point, actually, and it's a nice place to end, because if God is a role model for us, then we're supposed to care the way God cares, right? And with the way Zeus cares, at least, I mean, look, this is Heschel's reductive version of Zeus, right? Heschel, he's often mushing together Greek mythology and Greek philosophy. He's not the most systematic thinker. He's funny about systematization, but if Zeus cares about pretty girls, then that's the role model for that society, he's saying. But our God, the God of Israel, cares about the plight of orphans and widows, and therefore so are we supposed to. So God is that role model, right? God is it's not that we make God in our image, but rather God makes us in God's image, according to Heschel, and we are supposed to act like God, and God cares about these people, therefore so should we. So when we pick it up again next week, we're going to explore more deeply, who is the prophet? What does it mean to be a prophet, and what does it mean to hear God's voice? And then I'm really excited about this. With the end of our time next week, we're going to look at Heschel's speech on religion and race from 1963, which is the address during the conference where he met Martin Luther King. And we get to see his ideas in action and how he believed, how these ideas, these theologies led him to get involved in social justice work. So with that, we'll end. Thank you, everybody. I hope this was interesting. And I will see you, well, I'll see many of you this Shabbat, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, don't go. Just as you thank the Adult Ed Committee, it's our turn to thank you, the rabbi. We're looking forward to your lectures almost for a whole year, and we're really excited and looking forward to next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, or thank you, Wayne, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very good.
You're welcome. Thanks, Ralph.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do you believe that Joan of Arc was a prophet?